The Galactic Senate was normally a loud and bustling place, full of trills, grunts, shrieks, and all other manner of sound. Indeed, just as large as the Senate Hall itself was the Hall of Translation, just underneath the Senate floor, and a floor beneath that the Hall of Transcription. Advanced translation matrices worked constantly to break down individual languages and provide accurate accountancy of what was said, and more importantly, the intent of what was said. The standard translator that the Williamach species had devised over 8,000 cycles previously was used for individuals, and while it worked flawlessly for all that time, the sheer amount of voices in the Senate floor sometimes required a quarter of the processing power of the facility. Indeed, the Williamach had designed this venue so painstakingly that the general number of different languages being spoken simultaneously during the most heated debates could quintuple before any adjustments were needed. It was because of this dependable and marvelous feat of linguistic computer engineering that led the Hall of Transcription monitors to dispatch runners in alarm when it seemed like the system had stopped receiving input. There was no error. This was the day that the humans returned. The Senate was silent as a grave, and had been since the soft tone gave the speaker the floor to announce the arrival of the Terran Front delegation. A human in a black uniform stood at the Orion entrance with a Chua standing by his side in a smaller yet equally fitting uniform. Even the Atrocianti, usually the loudest sitting members of the Senate, were silent. All attention was passing between the two figures standing at the Orion entrance. The tall, solidly built human male and his short, slim, narrow-faced reptilian companion, and the seat of the Vral delegation with its sole representative. The 7th Orion War and the broadcast that had preceded it was fresh in the minds of everyone in the Senate. It had barely been 3 night cycles ago. As the human began walking, the general murmur of the Senate rose again, although much lower than normal. Every figure in attendance, save the Vral ambassador, seemed to be leaning in, hearing the hard tap of the human shoes on the tiled flooring, alongside the shuffle step of the Chua at his side. Voltka, on the other hand, was still leaning back. He was a Chikanamori, a species of pale-scaled observers. He had turned his head to watch the proceedings, supposedly to an outside observer with his good eye, as his other eye was notoriously short-sighted. It was a rarity for his species, but one that he had kept the appearances and the actual biological truth of, even though a fix for his astigmatism would have been an easy matter. Voltka said it gave him character. Voltka's staff knew better. His snake-like body rested beneath him, his 3-jointed arms crisscrossed behind his back. "I love the theater, do you not?" He whispered in his species' hissing tones to his second, who flicked his tongue approvingly while at the same time scenting the air. Voltka had been in his quarters nearby when the broadcast had come through, and he had to say he had never expected it. The Vral were a bunch of uncouth savages, and he had never paid their wars on their neighbors much mind, because quite simply there was so little that they could actually do from this distance. The Vral would never attack anyone they couldn't kill, or wage a war unless they knew they would win. And so, for almost the full 1,000 years, the Vral had been a thorn in the side of the galaxy as a whole. They would build up, attack, subdue, and grow. Every time they did this, their neighbors would collectively allow it, and one of those neighbors who did nothing would wind up the next target of the Vral's aggressive expansion. Voltka's long life had seen this happen no fewer than 12 times. The most recent, of course, being the way the Shesvi species had simply fallen apart in the face of Vral aggression, and the Vral going from that war immediately into a war with the Chua Republic. The human and Chua both stopped, not at the same time, but close to it, at the side of the plinth that held the symbol of the Chua Republic. The human glared daggers at the Vral a short distance away as the Chua stepped away from his human counterpart and moved to the front of the Chua Republic's plinth. The Senate kept a plinth for any species that still held a nation, even in exile, and as Voltka watched, he nodded slowly. "The rumors we heard were true." His second flicked his tongue again in acknowledgement, and Voltka leaned his good eye more. They had good seats for this. "The humans didn't subjugate the Chua. Interesting." The Galactic Senate was arranged in a circle, with the central seat being occupied by the speaker, the law reader, and the head scribe. They were all of the Nedramona, amorphous blobs of organic material. Where you sat in the Galactic Senate was entirely proportional to where your species was on a territorial map of the galaxy, if you flattened it out to a 2D representation and put it on a bowl. The Chikanomori's seat was on the direct opposite side of the Senate to the goings-on. A perfect seat to watch the drama unfolding. When the Viral had taken the Chua Republic's territory, it had been just assumed that the Chua were either wiped out or the humans had placed them in some sort of subservient role, standing in as their protectors. Voltka turned his attention to the Viral. The Viral stood quietly, the 3 antennae on its head twitching every so often. Its dark brown chitinous body stood stock still, balancing on its 2 sets of back and mid-limbs as its ovipositor quivered. The ever-present drool that came from its mouth between its split mandibles was, of course, there, but it had almost subsided completely. Its 4 eye stalks were locked on the human, ignoring the Chua, even as it dismounted the symbol of the Chua Republic from the plinth and half-carried, half-dragged it back to the human's side. Without a word, the human turned from the Vral, kneeling down next to the Chua as the Chua offered up the symbol of his former nation to him. "Very interesting," Voltka whispered. A tongue-flick response. The human walked to the plinth for United Earth, breaking eye contact with the Vral. The Chua fell in step behind him. Voltka had to admit the way this human was acting was a far cry from the representative who had been here last. Voltka never had reason to engage with him, as far away as United Earth was from Chikanomori space, but the human back then had been far more gregarious. This one, on the other hand, looked like he was ready to fight at the flick of the tail. The human walked behind the United Earth plinth and placed his hands on the raised platform in front of him. The Vral ambassador's plinth was only a short distance behind and beneath. It was traditional for a species to give a short speech whether they were first-timers or had taken a leave from the Senate itself. Voltka hated them. "Hello, we are the blah, we look forward to blah and blah working with all of you." Voltka had been here for a long, long time. His people possessed a lifespan that was considered extreme by most species, and he had been coiled at this spot in the Galactic Senate so long that he could easily remember when at least 100 new species had given their welcome address to the Senate. At least 50-some-odd addresses when a species returned to the Senate after so-and-so event had occurred. Voltka had long ago grown tired of them, especially the ones who droned on and on. The first address by the humans Voltka had actually witnessed as well. That one was a droner, a real droner. As the humans suddenly stepped back and kicked out hard and the Viral ambassador reflexively threw out its arms and tucked itself around his own plinth, as the symbol of United Earth's position on the galactic stage crashed to the ground and came apart. Voltka's eye widened. "Oh, this is going to be excellent!" He positively thrummed as the human hurled the symbol of the Chua Republic down into the wreckage of United Earth's plinth. It crashed and rolled. Delegates nearby moved away, some into the welcome and guiding hands of species who had been at the verge of war with each other for so long, it was laughable. The symbols of United Earth and the Chua Republic lay near the base of the Vral Empire's plinth. Voltka now leaned almost fully across his plinth, pushing himself up on his tail. The Vral ambassador stood, chittering wildly, and Voltka's scales shimmered in delight hearing the brutish Vral demanding the human be admonished for his behavior. "Shut the fuck up," the human positively roared, glaring at the suddenly silent Viral, and Voltka's entire body almost undulated in mirth. Delightful. Voltka was loving this with all of his liver, and would save the recordings of this to re-watch. The Pilanesti ambassador had simply fainted at his plinth, and he couldn't see what else was happening, but it was just so damned entertaining. "We, the Chua and the humans, are the Terran front," the human's voice carried despite having no amplifier. "And for now, we exist for only one reason, and one reason alone." The human's arm came up, and like he was hurling a spear, he pointed a finger at the Vral ambassador. "We are going to cut that cancerous, disgusting boil on the ass of this galaxy off, and we're going to burn it to ash." "Oh, I like them," his second whispered. "Indeed," Voltka hissed back. "We came to this galaxy with open arms, open hearts." The human continued. "We were met with silence and bureaucracy, laziness and the toleration of abominations, inaction, indifference, and indecisiveness. And due to it, when we actually had the bravery to stand against injustice, we were left to stand alone. The human threw out his arms. As they were left to stand alone, he motioned to where the plinths of several species used to be. "We are still here," the human yelled this sentiment at the Vral, and Voltka uncurled his arms from behind his back, placing them on his plinth. The human was silent for a few moments, then in a manner that Voltka had seen only a few times before. The human left his plinth and began walking. Voltka was already making mental notes, and the memory of the times where the Vral ambassadors in the past had done this was almost poetic. The human came within striking range of the Vral, stopping only as the Vral began to flinch away. "There is nothing you can take." The human slowly leaned forward, making sure he was heard even at Voltka's seat. "None of us have survived unwounded. Every reason we have to hate you, you have cut into us with 1,000 Vral knives. We are going to take back what you have stolen. We're going to find all those who you took from us, and then we're going to take everything you are and crush you. And there isn't a single damn thing you can do to stop us." Voltka's breath had long since left his body. He was transfixed. The story of the humans was one he had a familiarity with, but now he wished he had monitored their tale much closer. A species, no, 2 species that had been pushed so far to the brink had never really come back like this. Not in Voltka's living memory, that is. The human had let the silence hang for a few long moments. Then he said something that didn't carry. In fact, subconsciously everyone hung on until the translation came through. "You're going to learn how it feels. We're going to teach you," the human had said. The Vral was stock still, quiet. Voltka slowly leaned back and rested on his coiled form. The human stepped back from the Vral and looked towards the watching delegates. "We have very little business for this Senate. We do not care about your trade regulations or petty bickering about borders that hasn't gone anywhere in 500 years. We don't care about the endless, pointless bickering about traditions that weren't respected. We are here to say only 2 things. If you want to assist us, we welcome it. The second is this. We know the Vral has traded those that they have taken, enslaved." The human paused here, and it was only now the Voltka noticed that the Turinica plinth was occupied by a much different-looking member of that avian species than normal. The human continued, "We offer this proposal to any the Vral have sold to. Give them back." The human's gaze slowly drifted to the plinth of the Zonith nationality, and Voltka flecked his tongue with amusement at the way the slug-like creature's eye stalk seemed to withdraw. "Return them to us, and we will call it even. We will not seek any retribution. We will wash our hands of it." The Chua suddenly spoke, but with his chirping tones his speech wasn't heard. The human was silent. "Future gardens Chua grow. Future human young play. Future optimistic. Chua Terran. Human Terran. Join. You Terran." The human spun on his heel and walked back to the side of the Chua as the Chua continued chirping. "More Terrans soon." The little 4-digited paw of the Chua motioned to the area where the Sevesti plinth had once stood. "We come. Done here." The human and the Chua said nothing else, walking side by side past the Vral ambassador who was still tucked to the side of his plinth. They turned up the ramp and walked out of the Orion entrance. The Senate seemed to erupt into murmured conversations, but all eyes were on the Vral ambassador, who came back around to stand behind its plinth. Voltka looked to his second, then made a sharp gesture with his head. His second came to his side. "I'm going to send some messages back home and see if they agree with what I'm thinking." Voltka's second flicked his tongue once in agreement. "Are you believing we should aid the Terrans?" Voltka's second asked, and Voltka flicked his tongue in acknowledgement. "They are right. There's been too many like the Vral. We can't send a fleet, of course. Too much red tape, too many borders to cross." Voltka rested on his coils for a few more moments. "The humans are a young species, very young, and they are right. This Senate has become tolerant of too much, and so have we. This is going to change things. There may be war." His second whispered, "In our quadrant, I have little doubt. But we are well equipped for that." Voltka whispered back, "But the Terrans are right. This Senate has become too tolerant. We've become too tolerant. Blessed are the young, for they see the wrong in what we have merely seen as the way things are." Voltka picked up a datapad and his 6 fingers of his multi-digited hand delicately tapped a message. After a few moments, he nodded to himself and read over the message. With a tap of his finger, the message was sent, and Volka uncoiled his body, slithering towards his exit. There was much to do. It was about time.